Hello booktube, hello book friends, welcome back to my channel and another book tag video. Today I want to do the reading shifts tag. This was an original tag created by Hannah at Hannah's Books, and I was tagged by Pat at Book Chat with Pat, and this is basically, how many prompts are there? 7 prompts and a tag other people prompt about how your reading has changed over time and influences. So it's not um, about kind of books so much as sort of reading habits, I suppose is the best way to describe it. So let's get to the first prompt. So prompt number 1: how has your reading developed over your lifetime? Do the kind of books that bring you the most pleasure now differ from the books you loved most earlier in your life? If you have seen big changes in your reading since you've matured, what might explain your changing interests? So how has my reading I think over my lifetime my reading habits have broadened. Some of that has been as a result of um, education, life changes, that sort of thing. But I think, so the next part, do the books that bring you the most pleasure differ from the books that you love most earlier in your life? No, but I would say there are more types of books that give me pleasure. So I've always, even as a kid, so I kind of started out on I suppose the typical, what you'd call boys' adventure books, and I've talked about some of those before. So the Willard Price, the Hardy Boys, those sorts of books. But I guess over time, that has expanded into other authors. So Alistair MacLean. I think as I've grown, I've started to read a lot more non-fiction. Some of that relates to education. So, you know, when I was at university, a lot of the books I was reading were related to the course, or you know, were companions to topics that we were studying. Um, I don't think I'd say there are big changes. I just said that, but they would, if you looked at, say where I was at 10 years old to where I was at 50 years old, you'd see a big change. But over those, 40 years, it's gradual and incremental. Um, so all sorts of things have, I think, just following my nose almost is kind of explain my changing interests. So the other thing, when I was at university, I didn't have a lot of money to buy books outside of the ones I needed for my coursework. So I would, we would, when we were in a shared house, we'd borrow one another's books. We would, but get books from the library and so on. And what I was reading fiction wise at that time was very much kind of light and almost inconsequential. So a lot of novelizations and things like that. Just because I wanted entertainment rather than serious heavy books, because I was reading a lot of serious heavy books for my course. But nowadays, I also read kind of serious heavy books for, I won't say for fun, but that's part of my reading now. So yeah, I think, yes, it has developed over time, but it's broadened. Prompt number 2, do you find yourself choosing different kinds of books at different periods of the year? For example, do the seasons affect what you read for pleasure? Similarly, might you read very different kinds of books while on vacation? Um, there are certain books that remind me of certain times of the year. And again, I've talked about that on the channel before. So Susan Cooper's Oversea Under Stone always reminds me of summer, because that when I first read it, and it's kind of set in the summer, but when I first read it, it was summertime. Um, I would say generally no. Um, oh yeah, I read. Like we're just about to do a Dickens at Christmas, but I don't only read Dickens at Christmas time. In fact, next year I want to read more Dickens, so I won't just be waiting for another 12 months to roll around. Um, yeah, I mean, I think there are not necessarily seasons, but there are certain months of the year, and part of that is also I can blame booktube for that. So, we had PI July, which was reading books about private investigators. Um, I'm in the middle of Dr. November at the moment, so that's all about spy and espionage. So I think those, booktube has had an influence on reading certain books at different times of the year. It's not necessarily seasonal though. Do I read different books while on vacation? Um, no, but I often save a book if I know I'm going to be going. Um, if I've got a holiday coming up or something, I might save a book by a particular author that I enjoy, because then that means I know I'm going to have a book with me, that I know I'm going to enjoy. And very often, I will go away on holiday around my birthday, and people buy me books for my birthday. So I very often get books given to me for my birthday, and I'm on holiday at that point. So that has an interplay, but it's kind of a coincidental thing. It's not something I specifically would necessarily choose that book to read on holiday. Number 3, do specific experiences in your life ever shape what you choose to read? For example, did you read obsessively about child rearing when your kids were little, about gardening as spring is about to begin, about the experience of grief when someone you loved died? Hmm. I don't think any of those examples specifically applies to me. I talked about being at university, so that, yes, that did definitely. Um, was that me choosing to read, or because I had to read? I guess you chose to be there, so yeah, Um, I think not necessarily life experiences, but sometimes um, the world around me changing. So I read a lot of books um, around Germany in the 1930s into the Second World War, the rise of fascism, um, at a time when there were shades of that happening in the political sphere. And I wanted to kind of, there was lots of, this is, this government is like, and I wanted to kind of say, well, is it that bad? Um, so there were times when I will, um, they're not life experiences, but they are things happening in the world around me, and I choose to read books that um, relate to that or have some kind of historical connection to current events, if that makes sense. So yeah, that child rearing, gardening, and grief. No, um, I have read a lot of gardening books. I have to say, I enjoyed my garden, but again, you know, I don't specifically read them. Unless I need to know how to, what a particular plant needs to grow or whatever. Number 4, have there been any times in your life when circumstances have limited or changed your reading in some way? Perhaps caretaking responsibilities or a big move that made it hard to find as much time to read as you'd like, or personal illness that made it harder to concentrate, or maybe just long-term travel that might have limited your book choices. How do you deal with these circumstances? I, th- I think the travel most of all out of those examples. I don't think there's anything else. So at one point I was traveling a lot to and from work on a train, and I was at the same time I was also traveling for that job a lot, and that involved train travel, flights, all sorts, and some car journeys. And during that time, I was reading a lot more ebooks and a lot more audiobooks than physical books. So I was, the type of books I was reading, genre wise, wasn't different, but the method of consumption was. And at one point, I actually had two. I still have two Kindles, because I would have one by the side of my bed or in the house, and one that used to live in my work bag, purely because I was terrible at trying to remember to, when I got home, take it out of my bag, and then remembering in the morning to put it back in again. And so, because I could afford it at the time, you know, um, I had the luxury of being able to buy a second one, and because they sync, I was just able to do it that way. That kind of changed when I changed my job, because I wasn't traveling as much, or I wasn't traveling as much on planes. I was still traveling a lot on the train, and I was still driving. And the driving, I was mostly doing audiobooks and non-fiction audiobooks, because that was what was going in. I couldn't listen to fiction in the car. It wouldn't go in. So yeah, and then we had a pandemic, so I wasn't traveling at all, and my work has kind of changed. I travel a lot less now, which is, I think, good for me, personally. Um, but yeah, so I don't do as much traveling, and don't. Do I need two Kindles now? Probably not. I still keep them, charged and synced, and but I don't. Um, I can't read two at the same time, but I still do switch between the two. Um, so 5, booktube is full of discussions of reading slumps when dedicated readers seem to lose interest for a while in books. Sometimes they just can't find a book that appeals to them. Have you ever experienced a slump? If so, how do you handle it? If not, do you have any advice to give people who are experiencing slumps? The next question relates to this, so I'm going to try and split. No, yeah, I am going to split them. I was going to do them together, but I will split them. Reading slumps for me tend to have some external influence. And it tends to be not books so much. It will be, if my mental health isn't great, I don't want to read. I don't want to do anything. I just want to curl up in a corner. So I do experience periods when I can't find a book that appeals to them, but I want to talk about that as a response to the next prompt. If it's a reading slump, it's generally all books, no matter what they are. And as I say, it's some kind of external influence. It might, I hate the winter in particular. My mental health suffers a lot in the winter. And I tend to read less. And that's not because of the books. It's because, my head is not in a good place. So yeah. On that, how do I handle it? I just need to talk myself out of it. And that sounds very flippant, because if you've ever experienced any kind of mental health, it I find writing helps. Write it down. It helps. But yeah, so that's just me. And I'm not going to give, on the basis of what I've just said, I'm not going to give advice because, I don't particularly think I have a significant issue, but other people do. And I think it would be wrong for me to kind of say, oh, you just do this, which brings me to the next one. Prompt 6. Booktubers also talk about book hangovers when readers are so moved by a book that they find it difficult to move on to a new book. Have you ever felt this way? Absolutely, yes. And this is what when I struggle to settle into a new book, is very often because I have just finished one or a series of books or a particular topic area, and it's very much in my mind. And again, trying to move on to something new is not where my brain is at. So it doesn't matter necessarily what I move on to next. I'm still processing, I think quite slowly, I'm processing what I've just read. What does tend to work for me in this instance, though, are comfort reads. So, I can pick up a book by certain authors, and I've done a whole video on comfort reads, which, that will help, because I know it's an author, it's possibly a reread, so it's not, I'm not concentrating, or don't need necessarily to concentrate quite so much because I probably remember the broad plot. But yeah, so book hangovers, yes, and book slumps, yes, but one I would say is book related and one isn't. Number 7, tell us about a few books that almost always work for you, something that might have remained a favourite throughout your life despite any changing reading tastes, something that always seems to hit just the right spot when you need a lift, or perhaps some lifetime book hangover where the text will always be at the back of your mind. Okay, comfort reads. As I say, I've talked about these before. Authors like Dick Francis, Alistair MacLean, Stephen King, although I've still got quite a lot of Stephen King to read. Colin Dexter, so the kind of Inspector Morse crime series. Craig Thomas, I've talked about a lot on this channel. All of those authors pretty much are comfort reads for me. There are others. The Martin Walker Bruno the Detective series. They're all kind of crime thriller type books, apart from maybe Stephen King, which is is more horror. Although he does write, in the crime genre now. So yeah, any of those. There are bits of text that, and some of it is completely random bits of text, and I don't know why I remember them. There is a line about a guy driving a car, and the description is he's driving on the gears, and that is in one of Dick Francis's novels, which I read probably when I was a teenager, and I reread the book recently, and it's like that line, there it is. I'd forgotten which book it was in, but I knew it was a Dick Francis novel, and it was still in my head. And yeah, it's just one of those things. Anyway, tag other people. I think I was looking at Pat's video, and as usual, Pat has tagged a lot of people who I would normally tag. So I'll see if I can find a few people who Pat missed and tag them below. But thank you to Pat for tagging me. Thank you to Hannah for creating the tag. It's been a thoughtful process. So thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Pat. And as always, thank you to you guys for watching. And I will speak to you again soon. Take care. Bye-bye.